Good morning, everyone. Let me welcome you on behalf of ORSAM, Center for Middle Eastern Strategic Studies, as well as TOBB University of Economics and Technology. And also let me thank to Professor Fuat Kemal, the Director of ITC Istanbul Policy Center, for making this event possible. Actually, this is not the first time we are collaborating these three institutions in previous years on different topics in the same conference facilities. We did have other events, joint events. Since IPC doesn't have a functioning office activities in Ankara, we are taking advantage of this shortage. When they bring high caliber speakers to Turkey, they don't want to keep him or her in Istanbul or only, they also want to organize events in Ankara. This is where we step in and do our own part. And in the past, we did really have a good outcome from these meetings. And this time, today, we are honored to have Yazid Sayı. He doesn't need much introduction in the invitations. His biography was also provided. He is a leading thinker and analyst on regional affairs. He is based in Beirut, and he's actually here as part of an IPC Mercator fellowship program. He is carrying out a study on the civil-military relations region-wide. So as part of his project, he is also trying to understand the Turkish civil-military dynamics. He is in town to meet some officials, experts. So he was so kind to spare some time during his busy schedule to be with us at this event. In addition to his expertise on civil-military relations in the Middle East, he is also a very close follower of Syrian affairs, which is a very vital topic for all of us here, I believe. Today, we have several guests, participants from various Turkish institutions, embassies in Ankara, and also Turkish experts from different think tanks and universities. And we are honored to have this distinguished group together. And let me also say a few words about the format. Yazid will take about 25-30 minutes to outline his own take on the Syrian affairs the way forward, possibly. And then Fuat Hoca will also comment on his speech as well as sharing with us his own perspective. And I will invite the audience to contribute. Our intention is to have a free-flowing discussion because this is a topic that's evolving. There are no set rules, there are no set solutions for the ongoing problems. So the idea here is to also a little bit brainstorm about the future of Syria. We believe it is very critical for the stability of the region and also for the Turkish audience, for Turkey's own Middle East policies. And now I turn to Yazid to have his 25-30 minutes. Thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you. Well, I want to express my extreme gratitude to the Istanbul Policy Center-Sabancı University and the Mercator-Stiftung for the invitation to come to Turkey in the first place as a visiting fellow. It's a unique opportunity for me, although I've come often, I've never had this sort of formal affiliation, and I'm also extremely grateful to my and your hosts today, to the IPC, to the ORSAM Center for Middle East Studies, and of course to the TOBB Economic Political Faculty for the opportunity to meet you. I'll look forward to your comments and your insights because of course many of you are very well connected, better connected than I am in certain ways, and I'll be very interested to see where my analysis coincides with yours or where you differ. So I do hope that you'll do more than simply ask questions later on. if I look at my phone from time to time, it's just to check the time. I'm not messaging anyone. So Syria, the first thing I want to say immediately, and I'll come back to this later on and discuss again, is, but straight away I want to say I don't believe there will be a formal political solution in Syria at any time. In other words, a negotiated diplomatic outcome, negotiated in Geneva or somewhere. There will be a deal of some sort. There will be maybe a de facto outcome, maybe a political outcome in the sense that there will finally be some sort of new system, new whatever, maybe not very new, but an outcome and no war. But not, in my view, something where people sit around a table like this and actually negotiate diplomatically a deal. So power sharing transitions of the kinds that we've heard about many times since June 2012 with the Geneva I communique, or anything since then. I think Geneva I has been superseded by the Vienna framework of November 2015. The past Geneva talks that are yet to come, none of them, I believe, will be the framework for the final outcome in Syria. Now, to explain my reasoning, I'm going to look at the current situation, the evolving confrontations of Syria, and here I'm thinking in particular of the evolving situation in the Badia. This is the sort of desert or steppe region to the east of Damascus, along the Jordanian border, going towards Deir el-Zor in the east and the Iraqi border, where we know that the Americans are supporting Syrian opposition groups. Special forces, British and the US, have been in operation there for a while and now have a more overt presence. There's a lot of media speculation about what this means, where it will go. Will they end up confronting each other or not? There was the occasion when US aircraft hit a convoy of pro-regime forces trying to advance towards the Syrian opposition forces known as the Jaish Mahawir al-Thawra, the Syrian commandos army based near the Jordanian border at Tanaf and further from there, further north. This seemed to suggest some sort of new zone of control by US-backed forces. The other, of course, really important evolving situation is the battle for Raqqa in the north of Syria, much closer to the Turkish border, and in my view, the more interesting battle, the more immediate battle, not just militarily, but politically. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about both. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, if you like, operational questions, because I want to point out that if we analyze these carefully, I think we'll have a better idea of the political struggles that are going to come. So I'll start with Deir el-Zor. As most of you, I'm sure, will know, Deir el-Zor is the most eastern province of Syria on the border with Iraq. It contains the main city of Deir el-Zor, in which the regime maintains control of the airbase and of a small part of the city, and then is surrounded by Islamic State forces. The regime lost control of most of Deir el-Zor province early on in the revolution or the uprising, and then Islamic State took over. Now, this area is several hundred kilometers to the east of the populated areas of Syria, going from Homs down to Damascus. And this is an area where Islamic State has been very active. As you will know, they several times occupied the city of Palmyra, of Tadmor, and the gas fields around that, and then were pushed out yet again in the last few months. And the Syrian regime forces are trying to push east from Tadmor towards Al-Sukhna, which is the gateway ultimately to reach Deir el-Zor. Now here's the thing. My view is that there are no forces on the ground today that have the ability to defeat the Islamic State inside the population centers of Deir el-Zor. There's been a fair amount of public relations announcements by the Syrian opposition groups that have been trained and backed by the Americans operating in the south. They're operating obviously with support from Jordan, across the border. Press reports say that about 1,000 fighters were airlifted in recent weeks from Turkey, from the opposition forces working with Turkey, to Jordan in order to be able to open up a new front backed by the US and the UK to the east from El Tanaf and then towards Deir el-Zor. And in the past 2 or 3 months there has been at least one attempt by these various Syrian opposition forces to advance towards Al-Bukamal, which is one of the main towns in the east, in the area where the Jordanian, Syrian and Iraq border meet. And that is the beginning of a string of towns and villages that go up along the river towards Deir el-Zor city itself. My reading is that the Syrian opposition, despite US training and weapons supply and air support in the past half a year or so, I don't believe they have sufficient force to be able to cross, even if they're taken to the eastern parts of the Jordanian border, where they're closest to this populated region. Their ability to actually enter this region and expel the Islamic State from one town after another, I think, is limited. More importantly, their ability to take one town, move on to the next, but keep control of the first town, I think is also a big challenge that I'm not convinced they are ready to meet. If we look at opposition operations in the north of Syria, in the Jarablus area, fighting with Turkish backing to advance against the Islamic State, that was a very slow process. And it was only with the direct presence of Turkish troops supporting them with artillery, with armor, with special forces and so on, that the opposition was able to make some gains. And in my view, the most important gain they made, which was to take the city of Al-Bab, you'll recall that this took about 2 months, and of course the critical issue there was not a military one, it was a political one, of securing, I think with Russian mediation, the acceptance of the Syrian regime for an important city, Al-Bab, which by its name indicates its historic role as the door, the gate, the entrance to Aleppo. And this is why I think that operation took so long. For smaller Syrian opposition groups operating on much longer lines of supply and communication in southeast Syria, to advance in populated areas held by Islamic State, which have now become the main stronghold for Islamic State. It's clear that the Islamic State is concentrating on Deir el-Zor. I think that the Syrian opposition lacks that ability. And I am not convinced equally, of course I could be wrong, a lot of things have happened that none of us expected. The Jordanian army, in theory, could move in across the border to support operations. But bottom line is, unless someone, the US, the Jordanians, are ready to be present on the ground, supporting the Syrian opposition in fighting for population centers of the east, I don't think this will happen. I equally don't think that the regime has the ability to advance from Palmyra, Tadmur, to Al-Sukhna, and then further towards Deir el-Zor. The regime remains stretched militarily. They do not have enough manpower. This is evident. The Syrian army still is a relatively poor fighting force. Their ability in combat when they're fighting on their own, without support from Russian aircraft or from Hezbollah or others on the ground, remains not very impressive. There's still a lot of corruption. The regime army has held politically for various reasons, but this is not a regime army that has the ability in terms of operational effectiveness or of numbers of manpower to advance in the east while holding on to other areas, to maintaining the circle around Idlib province, to pushing out westwards from Aleppo city into western Aleppo province, to put pressure on the opposition around Damascus in the Ghouta, and also to build up the pressure in the south, in the city of Daraa and the areas around it. And as well, they have now had to open a small new front where they're advancing along the Jordanian border from Sueda to try and cut off the Syrian opposition forces that are trying to operate across the Jordanian border in the east. And this, of course, means more manpower. At the moment, it looks like it's more Iranian-backed militias, Hezbollah, that are doing that advance there along the border. But the bottom line is, the Syrian regime has to decide where to put its forces. It doesn't have enough manpower to fight on all these fronts in offensive operations. So I think that the regime also cannot really go all the way to Deir ez-Zor without risking its position elsewhere. And it has to make choices. In Iraq, the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, or at least some of their commanders, have made public statements about coming close to the border, that they are ready to cross the border and operate inside Syria. Of course, we've heard contrary statements from the Iraqi Prime Minister, Haider Abadi, who insisted that Iraq would not get drawn into action inside Syria. Of course, there's internal political dynamics in Iraq behind this partly. But if you also look at the map, I think the Popular Mobilization Forces, or any Iraqi forces, are still some distance from the border near Deir ez-Zor. They still face significant Islamic State areas. The idea that they're going to show up anytime soon in the vicinity of Deir ez-Zor, I think, is not realistic. Again, I could be wrong, but I think that this is part of a wider political military game rather than purely a military operational capability. So, in a way, what we see today in the area between Damascus and Deir ez-Zor, this Badia, the desert area, where the Syrian opposition groups are announcing that they've set up a new base, for instance. Last week they made this announcement, 60 or so kilometers away from Al-Tanaf. The regime is sending out pressure forces to sort of test whether the Americans will defend their space or not, and how far. So in a way, there's a shadow theater, a shadow war going on here, cowboys and Indians being played in the desert. And I think it's partly a situation where the different political and military actors are testing each other, examining the limits. It's interesting that the Russians were very quiet, if you like, about the American action, the fact that they're supporting opposition groups in the south when American aircraft struck the regime convoy 3 weeks ago or so, trying to advance towards Al-Tanaf. The Russian comment was very calm and very restrained. So it's clear that the Russians so far do not support and are not encouraging the Syrian regime to pick a fight in this area or to try and advance. And we can tell this from their statements, but also because Russian aircraft are not yet active in direct support of regime forces, unlike other battles in the past. And we've seen this pattern before. Last year, when after this announcement of the cessation of hostilities in February, there was later on an offensive south of Aleppo, which was the initiative of Iran using Iran-backed militias. Russian aircraft did not support this offensive, and the Iranians suffered heavy casualties. Similarly, when regime forces tried to advance to Tabqa on the road to Raqqa, again the Russians didn't support this move. The regime advanced alone and was very badly hurt by Islamic State and forced to retreat. On the other hand, the Russians, we saw their role in the final fall of Aleppo, whether with air support or with mediation, with negotiation with armed groups, providing military police safe passage. Their role there was highly active. So far it seems the Russians are not committed and therefore don't necessarily support what the regime is doing. Out of all this, I read a picture that I think will unfold and continue to unfold for some time. The battle for Deir ez-Zor is going to develop very slowly, just as the battle for Mosul did, for instance, in Iraq. It took many months. It took 2.5 years from when it was originally announced in 2014, but in reality, when it was actively launched last year, it then took many months to get to where we are today. So Deir ez-Zor is logistically a difficult one for all the forces that are on the ground, wherever they are. And therefore I think this is something that's going to unfold much more slowly. So the much more interesting question, far more interesting for everyone in this room, is Raqqa. My sense is the battle for Raqqa will be easier to win, quicker, for all sorts of reasons. Will the Islamic State fight to the very last man, to the finish for Raqqa, or will it start at some point evacuating some of its forces? We know already that key commanders, their families, the regional command had already moved away over the past 2 or 3 months. And the real battle for Islamic State, not the political battle, because Raqqa is their declared capital, but the military battle, the real one is to the east in Deir ez-Zor and across the border in Iraq. Trying to defend Raqqa and the areas connecting to Raqqa, probably at this stage is only worthwhile politically for the Islamic State. From a military perspective, they are better off conserving their forces and pulling them back to, put up a harder fight in the east. Whatever the outcome on the Islamic State side, I think that the battle for Raqqa militarily is not as challenging as the battle for Mosul, the battle for Deir ez-Zor. The real question is the day after. Who will control Raqqa? The Kurdish-led forces, Syrian Democratic Forces, with, even if Arab forces that are part of the SDF officially take over the city, will they be sufficient to hold it? Who will form the civilian administration? Western governments have already been planning for a stabilization mission after the liberation of Raqqa, but it's not clear that any of the Western governments, the British for instance, or the Dutch, or the Americans, the French, whoever, are actually going to place their own personnel on the ground inside Raqqa. Will this be Syrian opposition groups? But if so, which ones? The ones supported by Turkey under the guise of the Operation Euphrates Shield? Turkey, I'm sure, would like that, and Turkey has prepared, I understand they've trained 6,000 policemen now based in the Jarablus area, who, if that number is correct, are clearly more than is needed in that area. And that may well be to prepare them in order to move into Raqqa. But that requires a complex political arrangement with the PYD, the YPG, the Kurdish-led forces. The Russians have to also agree to this. The Syrian regime has to agree to this in some way or the other. I don't think any of the parties that are involved or invested in the liberation of Raqqa and in controlling it politically and administratively afterwards, I don't think there is enough common ground between them on who should control, what the formula is. Do you have a Manbij formula, the town to the west of the dam, of the Euphrates, where the Kurdish forces took the city? Turkey was clearly very unhappy, publicly said that they had to withdraw. And finally, the sort of political outcome of this, that the Russians mediated, was for the Kurds to accept that the Syrian regime in Damascus should officially regain administrative control of the city, while in effect, militarily, it's still the same, under SDF control, with both Russian and American military presence and flag raising, as you all know. Is that what will happen in Raqqa? Some sort of deal that brings Raqqa nominally under Damascus's control, but held by other forces, some of which may be Arab, but friendly to the Americans and to the Kurds. I don't see that's a comfortable outcome, but equally I don't see any of the other outcomes arising. For Turkey to accept a Kurdish control, I don't really see that, and I think statements from Turkey don't indicate, I think genuinely don't indicate acceptance, and I'll be very pleased to hear from you about that. The Americans right now seem to be the critical players in this, because they're the ones who really control the military plan for action on the ground, even if they coordinate with others, with Turkey, with Russia, with others. But operationally, it's their operation. And here we have a problem. that there are two American policies, or if you like, there is one policy which is driven by the military. And the military have a clear mission to defeat Islamic State, and they've decided where to put the emphasis. Mosul, Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, the south, they are in command of that whole theater of operations, and they deal with it as an integrated single theater of operations, so they're thinking strategically. And for them, Raqqa is just part of that bigger picture. And their plan basically is, we will liberate it, and then our other allies, our other friends of Syria, Western governments and so on, will be invited to come in and do the civilian stuff. The military, US military, you can understand why they think like this, but politically, I don't see that working. The problem on the US side is that there is no political policy, there's a military policy, because the Trump administration has no Syria policy. There is no policy on Syria, let's not fool ourselves. A lot of people waited for around this time, May, June, they thought by now we'll see what the Trump policy on Syria is. Well, here we are. There is no Trump policy on Syria. I see no signs of it. I don't think it will emerge. So what we could face is a very curious situation where Raqqa is liberated. You have to give it to someone. Suddenly the American administration is being told by its Western allies, by Turkey, by the Russians, by its own military, that we need a plan, a political plan. What will the Trump administration do at that point? I don't know. I'm pretty sure they don't know. I'm not even sure they're even thinking about it yet, although the Pentagon may be thinking about it already, but I don't think in the National Security Council or the White House, I don't think they have clarity on this. And that is where the possibility of involving the Damascus regime is not impossible, I think, because pragmatically, from Trump's perspective, he's not interested in resolving the Syria conflict. I'm not saying he opposes that, but it's not on his list of priorities. He's committed to defeating the Islamic State for all sorts of reasons, mostly domestic in America. And it's the one thing that he's invested big resources in since around mid-February. The Pentagon was given vastly increased military and intelligence assets and so on before they were even told what this was for. I mean, I know this from the people involved in this operation, that they were given the resources. And they hadn't been told whether this was for Iraq, for Syria, for this, for that. They had no idea. They were just given the resources. Because that was politically what Trump was invested in. And the policy, the political policy, will start to emerge de facto from having to deal with problems. As a problem arises, there will be a response. So we may find that Raqqa, interestingly, leads us closer towards the sort of final outcomes, questions of the final political outcome for Syria. I'll explain in the last few minutes of my presentation what I mean by this. Let me shift sideways and then connect. In my view, the Assad regime, this has been my conviction from day one and remains my conviction, the Assad regime not only, it does not want and cannot accept a formal, negotiated, diplomatic, political solution. For two reasons, very briefly. First, to have a formal deal with the Syrian opposition legitimizes the opposition. It doesn't matter who that opposition is so much, but it legitimizes the idea that there is someone other than the Syrian state represented by Bashar al-Assad who is also legitimate as a political actor in Syria and has a right to reshape politics in Syria. And this is something that the regime has never acknowledged, and frankly will face a lot of questions from its own base, its own loyalist constituency, saying, why have we fought for 5 or 6 years to accept a power-sharing arrangement that we could have had 5 years ago? Why did 400,000 people die in the meantime? So I think that's one big problem for the regime. It has to maintain its narrative in order to maintain its domestic internal control within its own camp. The second thing is, a formal diplomatic solution legitimizes the role, the legal standing of international law and of external powers, of external governments, in what happens next in Syria. Because probably a diplomatic solution will go to the United Nations Security Council to be ratified, and then in future, if there's a violation, if one of the contracting parties says, well, we think the regime is violating its obligations, we're going back to the Security Council, suddenly there's a different kind of framework which has already established the legitimacy of its intervention in Syrian politics with the agreement of the Syrian government. And for these reasons, I think that the Assad regime just is still as unwilling as ever to move in that direction. Where does this leave us? It leaves us with, I'll call it the Astana option. What's interesting about Astana, and as you know, I'm sure many of you, of course, Astana was never going to produce a Geneva-style political solution. People who criticized it, I think, missed the point. That wasn't the purpose. Russia, I think, would like a real political solution on Russian terms, favorable to the regime, but the regime won't accept even Russian terms for a political settlement. Turkey, I believe, would like genuine power sharing or transition in Syria, but that's not what is on the table at Astana. What's on the table has been a crisis management mechanism, allowing first and foremost Turkey, Russia, and to some extent Iran to regulate their relationship. And if you look at the debate that has been going on and the delay in the implementation of the full operational details of the de-escalation agreement, which involves putting foreign troops and monitors and a security cordon around the de-escalation zones inside Syria, this has been delayed and delayed and delayed. This isn't about problems with the regime or with the opposition. I mean, there will be problems with the regime, I'm sure, but we're not even there yet. This is still a negotiation between the three main parties. And whether they will agree or not, I'm not so sure yet. But the most important thing is, even if Astana succeeds fully in achieving de-escalation across all areas of Syria except for the Islamic State fight, which I think is welcome, we will be in a new area of, if you like, a very healthy area in a way of no bloodshed, of new political social dynamics, of ordinary Syrians being able to say, we don't want a war anymore. The regime will have to look for new ways to control people, to find capital, to feed people. I mean, there are all sorts of other challenges that the regime has been thinking about, trying to find new sources of capital, of investment, changing real estate laws in Syria, inviting Chinese investors, etc. There will be new complex dynamics, but with regard to the political process, my sense is this, that there will be a de facto situation in which the logic of the de-escalation process will then become a de facto political logic, which is, okay, you, the opposition, control Idlib, you control Daraa, a pocket north of Homs, the BC Rastan. Maybe they still control Ghouta, maybe not by then, we'll see. These main pockets. And as part of this triangular relationship or dialogue between Turkey, Russia and Iran, backed in various ways by the US, possibly, we will have, I think, a process of gradual reconciliation, to use the regime term, reintegration of these opposition areas back within the Syrian state structure. There will not be a formal negotiated power-sharing deal. There will be the offer that the Provincial Council for Idlib of the opposition can relink to the Ministry of Local Government and maybe even receive a budget from it. And it will be recognized as an official council. The opposition armed groups will be pushed to unite under one military umbrella, as they were, for instance, with the Euphrates Shield. And we've heard several times in the past 6 months or so suggestions and proposals and calls to form the armed groups in Idlib into one national revolutionary army. Ultimately, I think whether it's for this set of militias or for the Kurdish militias and the YPG, which eventually have no choice but to deal with Damascus and whoever is in Damascus. They have no other choice. So the question is, how do you reintegrate the administrative structures they've built and the military structures they've built? And I think it'll be the same answer in both cases, that they'll be allowed a lot of autonomy. You stay there, you run things, you keep your weapons, that's fine. But over the next year, next 2 years, you'll come under the Ministry of Local Government, and you'll come under the Ministry of Defense. We'll call you the National Guard, the Provincial Guard, the Northern Guard, the Idlib Guard. There'll be various names. The Syrian army, since the beginning of last year, has already created 2 new army corps, specifically in order to integrate the various non-army units, the National Defense Forces in the 4th Corps, and then the 5th Corps was created to bring in all the other militias, joint task forces, the Desert Falcons, all these groups, also under a formal army structure and ultimately under the Defense Ministry. So they may create a 6th Army Corps or just integrate these other militias, armed opposition, Kurdish, etc., within the 4th or the 5th Corps. Maybe we're still 1 or 2 years away from this, I don't know. But I see this as the ceiling. And I'll finish by saying one thing, the very final word will be on Raqqa again, but last week we hosted 2 members of the Syrian opposition who are basically close to the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, based in Turkey, who approached us. I've met them before, and they approached our center, Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, requesting to have a joint panel. And we were very happy to oblige, and we were open to everyone. It was very interesting. So they wanted to come to Beirut. First of all, they felt safe coming to Beirut, which was interesting. Second, they wanted a public platform in Beirut. And what they said was extremely interesting. They said 2 things, basically. They said several things, but the 2 I want to mention are this. That first of all, Asitana is actually a very interesting approach because it's just about a ceasefire. It's not about a political solution. It's pragmatic, it's practical. And if we get this, we can then build on the de-escalation and work from there. So operationally, they've moved very interestingly. And the second thing they said was, we're not going to agree on the big politics, but there are many other things that we can both agree on, we and the regime. Passports, people need identity cards, these pragmatic things. So suddenly we're not talking about Bashar al-Assad leaving power, we're not talking about the revolution, we're not talking about power sharing, we're talking about simple pragmatic measures that will allow the 2 sides to find some common ground. There was no mention of all these other things, the big things. I thought that was a very interesting message someone wanted to deliver from our panel, from our platform. And my reading is, this is the direction. And it's interesting that people who go to Damascus, mediators, foreign mediators, are coming back with a sort of message that this sort of reintegration, reconciliation over 1 or 2 years is acceptable to Bashar al-Assad. Now, whether it's already yet acceptable to Turkey, or the USA, or the EU, or Russia, I'm not saying. I just suggest that this is the trend we're going towards. Raqqa will either be a problem because it's come too early, that this bigger picture is not yet ready, and Raqqa suddenly faces us with a case study where what I'm talking about could start happening straight away. So either it'll be resolved in a way that gives us a very clear signal to what's the direction we're going in, or it's going to become highly contentious and problematic and unresolved for a while in some frozen situation that I can't exactly predict. So finally then, Syria is left, I think, for the coming 1 or 2 years in terms of conflict and violence going ahead in the eastern areas. But I think already in terms of our ability to read where Syria is going politically on the Syrian conflict, then this is my analysis of that picture. Whether it takes a year to unfold, 2 years to unfold, 3 years to unfold, I won't say, but I think this is the trend now, and I think that we are past the point of reversing this. Astana, in a way, marked the moment when the ceiling was set on what the Syrian opposition and its supporters could expect in Syria. And I think everyone now, every day, we go deeper into the Astana process. I'm not opposing it, I'm just analyzing. Every day it becomes harder for the Syrian opposition or other parties to this process to walk back. And we go deeper, and with every step, then the next step becomes inevitable, and then the next step becomes inevitable. And I'll look forward to your comments. Many thanks.
Thank you, Yazid. Now I turn to Fuat Hoca.
Thank you, Shaban. I mean, my role actually is to thank Yazid for this extremely eloquent account and analysis of the Syrian crisis, and also thank Shaban for making this possible. As director of the Istanbul Policy Center, I extend my welcome and thank you, all of you actually coming in and sharing this discussion, important discussion actually with us. I will be very brief, just actually mention three extremely important points that Yazid has made. I agree with all of them. The first actually is the time for the formal and political solution to the Syrian crisis, I think, is over. And then now we are in the stage where we are supposed to be more pragmatic, we are supposed to be more crisis management oriented, and actually so more spaces maybe will be opened up for negotiations. And as a matter of fact, I think the last point about the actually panel in Beirut indicates from meta-narratives, from maximalist demands and visions. I think all actors are coming in to finding out some kind of optimal solution, which will actually bring the crisis management on the table rather than seeking for formal and political solutions. Of course, that means that maybe we might actually have the escalation process or maybe little post-conflict process, but nevertheless the problem will continue, and I will actually come to that one. The second one actually is I also agree with him in terms of what he said about Raqqa, that the battle in Raqqa might be actually a short win, but nevertheless what is important actually is the day after. Not from the Turkey's point of view, but also from the region's point of view. As it is becoming more and more clear and evident that post-Raqqa is more important than Raqqa. Who will actually govern Raqqa? Who will constitute or create, establish the administration in Raqqa? And even we don't have power sharing, but what kind of actually actors involved in the governance of Raqqa? As a matter of fact, in addition to the point that there will be no formal and political solution to Syria, I think we are becoming more and more actually, reaching to the situation where we have to think about how are we going to deal with the failed state situation in Syria and Iraq. As a matter of fact, everybody is now focusing on how to rebuild the state, how to rebuild institutions. And there actually we have two layers. One actually is the sort of a macro sort of institutional layer, but on the other hand there's also the everyday life of governance. And as a matter of fact, there it is very important who actually takes the role, who has what, and one actually should be pragmatic in that way and then try to link macro and micro layers of analysis. But the third one is, as this Qatar crisis or problem indicates, this actually bothers all of us. When we talk about Syrian crisis, we are talking about three layers of crises happening at the same time. One actually is the crisis in Syria, and of course which has the refugee crisis, which has the Daesh crisis, and which has the failed state crisis. And as a matter of fact, from Turkey's point of view, Turkey is as I call it at the heart of all these three crises, and because of the borders and everything, Turkey is actually right now 3.2 million Syrian refugees at home, and from my writings I use it, and I could actually put it here too. French philosopher Jacques Derrida's critique of European migration policies, in which he talks about hospitality. But Turkey actually has been, applying what I call unconditional hospitality to Syrian and the other refugees. But of course, the longer this hospitality takes, the more difficult it becomes to sustain it. And as a matter of fact, right now, hospitality would not be enough to govern this issue. But the second one actually is, of course, what triggers this refugee crisis, the Daesh problem, and of course now there is a battle against Daesh, and then third actually is the failed state problem. So this is actually one layer where we talk about the Syrian crisis, is the simultaneous occurrence of three significant problems: refugee, Daesh, and the failed state. But at the same time, as you all know, and better than better than I do, the Syrian crisis is also a proxy, for the a number of actors getting in and trying to implement their own interest rather than dealing with Syrian, crisis in its own context. Russia has its own interest. The United States has its own interest. So in this sense, there's kind of a hegemonic power interest, is kind of replacing the Syrian crisis. So it is, of course, why the formal and political solution is becoming impossible, and the reasons should be sought also in this two layers, because in one layer you might actually try to find solution, but this geopolitical power game is actually creating a big hurdle to this one. But of course, as if this is not enough for the region, there is also a third layer, which actually the Qatar crisis actually indicates. There is also this big, geopolitical, game over the region as a whole, and which started with the Arab Spring. But right now, all the tectonic stones are shaking the region, and of course there is also this Iran. Whether or not we will actually integrate Iran, or we will actually think about Iran as a sort of enemy, or whether we should actually contain Iran rather than integrate Iran. I think maybe Trump administration doesn't have a sort of a clear Syrian policy, but I see extremely clear this difference between the Obama administration's approach to Iran and the Trump administration approach to Iran. One, it was based on the integration of Iran, at least thinking of Iran in terms of how to integrate Iran in the system. Right now, of course, there is a very clear rupture there that I think today and tomorrow, Iran will be seen by the Washington as a kind of a hegemonic power whose ambitions need to be contained, or an enemy to Israel, whose actually ambitions should be contained. So from system integration to containment actually is a big point or benchmark that we have to keep in them. So there's also the third layer of sort of a reshuffling the power configuration in the Middle East. So the Syrian war in its own context, Syrian war as proxy, and Syrian war involved in the geopolitical reconstruction of the region as a whole. So that actually makes the point that your first point very, very clear, that we cannot actually think about, realistically speaking, we cannot think about a sort of a formal and political solution of Syrian problem. But in addition to this important point about pragmatism, I think from the Qatar crisis or proxy discussions and the Syrian crisis discussion, what concerns me is the increasing emphasis placed on security at the expense of democracy and humanitarianism. And as a matter of fact, right now, the more we talk about the military operations, the more talk about the military relations versus political configurations and so on and so forth, then we actually securitize the issue. maybe more than it actually needs to be securitized, and this actually becomes at the expense of sort of thinking about how to restructure the Syrian state, how to envision the region from a humanitarian point of view, from a moral point of view. As a matter of fact, from Qatar crisis to Syrian crisis, from geopolitical hegemonic war games on Syria to geopolitical interest and hegemonic war games on the region, there is an emphasis on security over again and again. That actually let me finish this way, from an international relations point of view, this is kind of a reaffirmation of what the John Mersheimer says, that the state should be skeptical, and in order to actually eliminate their skepticism, they should be aggressive militarily. So he calls it this aggressive realism, and as a matter of fact, one of the main hurdles to this, formal and political solution is the fact that the more we securitize or even talk about the region, the more actually we open a space for aggressive realism. But we might need to be realistic, and we might need to realist in that sense, because of course, as Yazid put it very clearly, there is actually a battle against Daesh. There is actually a battle going on, so we cannot sort of close our eyes to realism. But my question actually is, should we be aggressive in implementing realism in the region? When I look at Turkish foreign policy in recent years, despite all the problems it has, despite all the impasse it has actually faced right now, but Turkey has a claim, which actually I find it actually in the very beginning of the Euphrates Shield and the Turkey's approach on refugee crisis. One should be realist in the way in which it deals with the situation, because there are security concerns. But one could be also humanitarian and moral, paying attention to the human condition in Syria, paying attention to moral issues in Syria. In talking about the state restructuring, paying attention also the question of what kind of state reconstruction. We could talk about pragmatism, but what kind of pragmatism? I think what I call moral realism maybe is actually needed right now. And then Turkey, both in conflict situation and the post-conflict situation, is one of the actors that could contribute to the sort of finding a pragmatic or crisis management solution to Syria, to the region, because we cannot be leave ourselves totally unarmed to the security logic by actually ignoring and putting aside all the moral issues, all the humanitarian issues. I think in that sense, we should actually be realistic in the way in which we think about the situation, but nevertheless, I think we should also listen to Turkey, despite all the problems in terms of foreign policy and everything, that the importance of being moral and humanitarian in the way in which actually we look at the post-conflict, post-Raqqa, post-Syria, and post-region.
Now I would love to invite the participants to share your own perspectives on the points made already here, or other points that you want to bring to the attention of the audience. Who wants to? If you could also introduce yourself, it would be appreciated.
Okay. My name is Umar Karim. I am a doctoral researcher at University of Birmingham. And I was listening to Mr. Yazid's talk, and it was really illuminating. But I had 2 or 3 general points which I think have been overshadowed, or the whole crisis is so complex that it just goes into you can't explain them. What is the actual nature of Syrian state right now? Because I think the Syrian state as a concept doesn't exist anymore. It's a state or a regime which has franchised different areas to local warlords. And they are very much autonomous in their own conduct. If you just see the situation with Zahir Hassan and his Nimr forces in Hama and the Sakur al-Sahara in Latakia and other regions. And also on the Syrian opposition side, you mentioned some people close to the Muslim Brotherhood, but are they equally representative in specifically the Idlib area or the military factions in Idlib? I mean, in terms of Astana process, probably Turkey can enforce terms or things with the Euphrates Shield guys and people which are directly related with Turkey. Even within the Euphrates Shield territory, things are very complex now. We have seen this fighting in Al-Bab, and so these things are going on there as well. And just on a broader picture, in terms of broader picture for Syria, I think Iran and regime, not Russia, they have been very clear that we have to take different strategic points. Maybe for Iran the strategic points were Aleppo and also now Deir Zour, but for regime it's whole of Syria. And not for like it wants it, but maybe to just put up to the word that we control every inch of Syria, but it doesn't matter if the local warlords, they do it, but just on paper we control it. So, is this really a de-escalation going on, or is it just like they're just taking time and doing things their own way? Like we can see a clear pattern emerging in Dara, they're continuously bombing, and probably as you mentioned also in Ghouta, and maybe afterwards they are now going to Deir Zour, and then of course, I mean, to Idlib. So how do you see this whole?
Okay. Well, thanks for that. I mean, the first question about the Syrian state, how much of a state is it, is a very good question, a very interesting question. And by using the term state, I don't imply any normative value, i.e. that this is a real state, depending on whatever that means. But, I mean, in a way, it's not as if the Syrian state was a state of a particular kind and then changed to stop being that kind of state. I mean, in many key respects, it's the same Syrian state. It's just that we see things slightly differently. So, what do I mean by that? Clearly, a lot of state institutions, services and so on have been hollowed out. The ability of state agencies of various kinds to deliver services and so on is far weaker. But it's also fair to say that a lot of the key Syrian state agencies never totally stopped what they did, whatever that was. I mean, going into the souk and inspecting prices, or the central bank, trying to control dollar prices or whatever. There was always at least the performance of what a normal state does. And so that discursive level, if you like, of the state was always performed, was always still played. Now, let's try and avoid, clearly, we don't have to believe Bashar al-Assad when he presents things his way, and the Syrian state still functions, and I represent the sovereign will of the people, and that's all. Okay, but let's not go the opposite extreme of not recognizing how this Syrian state still functions. And it does. For one thing, salaries are still paid. Now, the salaries may be worth a lot less than they used to be, but they're still paid. And in a way, the Syrian state is very decrepit, it's weak, it's far weaker than it used to be, far poorer than it used to be. But ironically, sadly, throughout this crisis, the Syrian regime / state has always been a little bit better organized than the opposition has been overall, for all sorts of reasons. I'm not blaming anyone here, but I'm just saying. The Syrian regime was better able to organize, to coordinate, to think, to plan, to prioritize, and therefore to use assistance, whether this was financial, economic, military, from Iran, from Russia, from whoever, than the opposition ever was. So the regime was always 10 or 15%, points ahead of the opposition. It just always was. It was a sort of an infrastructural advantage. But I want to say one more thing about, our understanding of this Syrian state. Syria has always operated, at least under the Ba'ath, and since Hafiz al-Assad and then his son came to power, the key dynamic has been the regime, i.e. the networks that operate behind the formal structure. That's what's kept this working. That's why the regime didn't collapse. Take the army, I mentioned it earlier. The Syrian army has a formal command structure like any other modern army, but the formal command structure was never how the Syrian army functioned and how it took its orders and how it operated in the field. Rather, it's always been, especially in this war, that the regime, through its networks in the army, and I don't mean through the Ba'ath Party, I mean its own direct networks, kept this body alive. It's like, you've got a body and then behind it you've got wires attached to something behind that's pulling everything and making it work. This is how the regime kept the army going, and why the army did not break up. The cohesion wasn't the cohesion of a professional military, it was the cohesion of tied together by the regime. The nervous system is the regime network. But that's also how it's kept the economy running, its economy. And yes, they've devolved a lot of power and autonomy to local actors. You find your own money, your own budget, we won't pay you salaries, you find your own salaries, do what you want, as long as at the end you're loyal to the regime, as and when we need you. Now there is a risk that at a certain moment, the balance of power and influence between these local warlords and the regime tips. So far, they still accept that the regime is stronger than them, and when the regime says, stop this, do that, they do. They respond. And we've seen that, for instance, in fights between the army and militia units. Sometimes they fight over things like a checkpoint from which they earn, income. But when the army has a very strong view on something, the army wins in these fights. And when the regime leadership has a view, it wins. Maybe a day will come when suddenly all these local actors realize that they don't need the regime. And, that could happen maybe with a ceasefire. It's not clear when this will happen. The regime, I think, with a ceasefire and then with peace, faces a huge challenge of how to find enough capital to reconstruct. Even if they reconstruct only loyalist areas, they don't help opposition areas, they have a huge problem. I mean, just paying with pensions to the wives, the widows of their soldiers, their own soldiers, I don't think they've got the money for this. So they've got huge problems down the line. But let's not underestimate their ability to survive. And that's all they're doing. And this is why from the first day of this crisis, everyone was expecting the regime to fall within 2 weeks, 3 weeks. In Beirut, when I was there, I remember my director believed it was going to fall within days. My analysis was the opposite, because I looked at how the regime operates historically and the nature of its social alliances, the nature of Syrian society. Anyway, I mean, I could go on about that, but the fact is that even throughout all this war, there's been a lot of aspects in which the sort of internal dynamics you touched on with reference to, say, Al-Bab or Euphrates Shield, there are highly intricate local dynamics, which means that people who saw this as, pro-democracy against dictatorship, or Sunni against whatever, Alawi, all missed the point. Because they overlooked the fact that, say, everyone in Raqqa province is Sunni, but they didn't rise against the regime, for instance, until the opposition came in and took it over. The same goes for Aleppo. The people fighting in western Aleppo until December, when some Shia militias came in to assault the east. But the defenders of western Aleppo and the people fighting to the south of Aleppo were all Sunnis, Sunni clans. So, you know, we have to have a far more intricate sociological understanding of this regime and what drives things. I think that's enough maybe on that point.
Thank you, Shaban. Dr. Ahmet Uysal, the director of Iranian Studies Center and also professor in Istanbul University. I think that just a point, and then maybe the dynamics of the game changed after the recent bombs in Iran, also the Qatari crisis, because in the Obama period, Iran thought that they can take over most of the Middle East, especially the Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Now, I think they are going to have a second thought on their calculation, whether they overextended or not. Probably they be asking what how they get involved in this situation. And I know the Syrian regime almost collapsed 3 times. One time it was collapsing. The Hezbollah came from Lebanon to rescue. Then Iranians themselves. Then they are about to fall, and Russians came. And we already know that the dynamic. Iran was not happy with or was not very eager on the Astana process, because they were having a maximalist approach. Now, probably after the second, the recent bombing, probably they are going to be more worried. But how this going to affect the situation on the ground, it's of course open to question. And Dr. Yazid, also I want to get your feed on the feedback or your thought on how Iran is calculating, because still a major player with direct support to the government and its militias on many grounds. Thank you.
My name is Fadi Frasin. I'm from the organization of Islamic Cooperation. I just have a quick question to Mr. Yazid. In the future, in northern Syria, do you see any potential parallels with northern Iraq? Thank you.
Yashar Bey in the back. Could you wait for the mic, please? Yashar Bey.
Yashar Yakış, former Foreign Minister of Turkey. I think that what you said regarding the who should be running Raqqa, you also mentioned the fact that Raqqa is predominantly or 100% Sunni province, but it did not revolt against the regime. In light of this assessment, I would like to go one step back and combine the role of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is dominated by YPG, liberating Raqqa from Daesh, and agreeing to withdraw and leaving the administration to the local people, Arabs. Since the beginning, actually it turned out that your assessment regarding whether the regime is going to be falling within days or it will last longer. I was perhaps one of the very few people in Turkey in the year 2011 that compared the fall of Bashar Assad. It should be compared to predicting earthquake. It may take in 3 days' time. It may not take place in 3 years' time. So after that, when Turkey was negotiating with the Syrian Kurds and asking the Syrian Kurds to side with Turkey against the regime, the Syrian Kurds, Saleh Muslim was not able to accept this because he may have thought that if Assad survives, would Turkey be able to save me from Assad's hands? So he did not agree to side with Turkey against Assad. If these negotiations were to be held on the solid ground, the best solution, in my opinion, was to cooperate, Turkey and the Syrian Kurds to cooperate, get from them the promise that they will not change the ethnic composition of the places that they occupy, like the one that they have done in Kobane, which is reflected in the Amnesty International report. And now do same thing with something that you mentioned regarding the administration of Raqqa. Persuade, together with the international community, Turkey and the international deciding on one side, and persuading the Syrian democratic forces not to stay there, hand over the administration to Raqqa, since Raqqans were already somewhere in the administration. They were public servants, tax collector, post office man, etc. They are still there, or they may have fled because of the Daesh invasion, and then when the city will be liberated, they will be coming back. And since they did not revolt against the regime agreeing to bringing them back and let the administration of the city to Arabs, to the original owners, original inhabitants of the city. How realistic is this scenario? Thank you.
أولا عفوا كلمة عربية شوية. Why I'm saying this is, I mean, we are talking about Syria, future of Syria in English. And I don't know how many Syrians in the salon also. I'm Mehmet from Turkish Red Crescent, and coming from humanitarian perspective, that's why mostly more than macro politics, micro things are my topic. I'm much more interested. I mean, it's a second question, but I don't know how much this question can find some answer, but how much the humanitarian situations can shape the politics, the global politics, the regional politics, because at the end the civilians are affected. We are talking millions of people are IDP, millions of people are refugee, and even I don't think that in the regime side, everybody's life changed, whether some items, some goods are coming or not. I mean, the income, as you said, is decreased. That's why everybody's life in Syria has changed. Even Assad's family's life has changed. That's why I don't know how this humanitarian situation can shape or possible to shape the global and regional politics. And about Astana, we were happy because of the humanitarian chances that can bring. I mean, the ceasefire, possible ceasefire, the escalations. Because what we see is, unfortunately, or what we can do is currently is just palliative things, how to give protheses for some individuals, or how to give just food instead of letting them to go back to their houses, just a tent or shelter. That's all. What we are doing is mostly about really temporary things. And just the second thing is about the Syria crisis as humanitarians. The most difficult thing is this is as a terminology. It's a complex humanitarian situation. What I mean, at the same time, we should be faced with the emergency things, because it's a very dynamic environment. Every time, every day, every week, one group of people is moving one area to another place. That's why at that time it's becoming a new situation. New shelter, new NFIs, new food is needed. And the middle term, they need other needs, and the long term, they need, I mean, occupational training to the microcredit, different level of needs is needed. That's why I don't know how, as the old humanitarians or as the academicians, as think tankers, we can give parameters for policymakers, for decision makers to shape their policy on the humanitarian perspective. Thanks.
almost another lecture. Well, very, very interesting, useful comments and questions. I mean, on Iran, I will defer to your expertise. I mean, it could be that Iran will start to feel overextended. However, if I were in their shoes, my guess is that they're going to be nervous about how far the Trump administration will go. And I probably would, while maybe trying to soften the image, talk to the Europeans, stay on good terms with Russia and China, etc., but I would also not give up my assets, and I count Syria and Hezbollah as one of those assets. I mean, if Trump were to say, what I want with you is a deal, give up on Hezbollah, for instance, and in return, I'm going to lift the sanctions completely, okay, then we'd have a different kind of discussion. But so long as Iran expects to come under more and more pressure from the US, then I don't think they're going to get any softer anywhere else, and certainly not in Syria. I think of all the parties, the external parties that have a genuine stake, a real interest in Syria, there's only two. Iran, I mean, it's partly ideological, partly strategic, the relationship with Hezbollah and with Syria itself. Even though the relationship with Iraq for them now could, make up for losses or weakness in Syria, but I don't think they'll give up on Syria unnecessarily. And Turkey, which of course, for which the Kurdish issue is sort of number 1, 2, and 3. These two have a real interest in the outcome. For Iran, it's the whole of Syria and the nature of power and so on. For Turkey, it's more specific and in a way, ideally more resolvable. And I mean, I'll immediately come to the foreign minister's comment that, I mean, the idea of cooperation is very bold. I must say I hadn't thought of it. And I think if that was something possible, well, yes, I think that would be, I mean, whether it's a real possibility, I can't judge. But whether it would be transformative, I think yes. But I was going to touch on this issue, the Kurdish question, because Fadi Farasin also raised it. You were more diplomatic. You talked about the potential parallel with northern Iraq. We're talking about Kurdish autonomy, KRG style, Kurdistan, Erbil. So I'll tackle the Kurdish issue as I understand it and see it from outside. My hunch is, to link those questions together, those comments together, is that we're not going to see a different Turkish position on the Kurdish issue inside Syria without a parallel shift on the government PKK dialogue, direct or indirect, inside Turkey. Or let's say the Turkish-Kurdish relationship inside Turkey and Turkish Syria policy in Syria are related. They'll sort of go in opposite ways or together, but they're linked. My sense would be, for instance, I mean, I may be wrong, and I really hope to hear from people here on this, that if the Turkish leadership wished to, for instance, pave the way for a future resumption of peace talks or dialogue or reconciliation inside Turkey, I would look for signs of that by seeing a softening of the Turkish position on what's happening inside Syria. And maybe vice versa. And it would be fascinating, that if, for instance, the outcome of Raqqa were to trigger this kind of thinking, that maybe then would open the way for different thinking or a new political dynamic inside Turkey. It's my hunch that the two will remain related. And if the Turkish threat perception vis-a-vis Kurdish, whatever it is, autonomy, for instance, in Syria, if that threat perception recedes, then in a way it would be possible to separate what happens in Syria stays in Syria. And therefore we can deal with what happens in Turkey separately without worrying all the time about cross-border linkages, which exist and they're important. Because that's what happened with Kurdistan in Iraq. I mean, the Kurds in Iraq ultimately, at least for the KRG government in Erbil and the KDP and Barzani, their relations with Turkey, we all know, are far, far, far better than they were once upon a time. I mean, there was a time when that was hard to imagine. Now, of course, that also points to something else, which is the complexity of Kurdish politics and Kurdish dynamics, because the KRG itself is disunited. Sadly, they're in a sort of constitutional crisis. Their whole relationship with Baghdad is still far from being resolved. I mean, there's the issue of a referendum on independence, but my sense is that Kurdistan, Iraq, is not ready politically for these various reasons, and is not ready for economic independence, financial independence from Baghdad. So that is complex, and that, of course, then reflects on the complexity of Kurdish politics in Syria. The last thing I want to say on this question here, on the parallel again with northern Iraq. First, the Syrian Kurds, whether it's the people who are closer to the Arab opposition, the Kurdish National Council and so on, or it's the PYD, have been careful to say that we don't seek independence, we don't seek a separate Syrian state, Kurdish state in Syria. And I think that at least for the foreseeable future that's true. I mean, that's genuine, let's say, if only because of realistic understanding that it's not going to happen. But here's the interesting thing. If I'm right that down the line there's going to be some sort of de facto political outcome in which basically everyone has to go back to dealing with Damascus with varying levels of autonomy, that also implies the Kurds. Right now, and over the last few years, they've had a lot of freedom of maneuver. They took advantage. They created a big zone, they linked it, they moved west, and then they got a bit too bold, and they tried to cross over the Euphrates after having been warned not to link up with the Afrin enclave. And they clearly had, hubris. They overestimated what they could do. They thought the Americans are behind us. They didn't learn the lesson that the Americans in Iraq, despite the fact that the KRG is almost an independent state, institutionally, politically, and so on, juridically, even in Iraq, the US is careful to operate through Baghdad. They won't talk about Kurdish independence. So in Syria, the Americans are not behind the PYD on political issues. They're they're not going to make it difficult to reach a political solution in Syria just because they like the Kurds. So sooner or later, and we already see, I think the Kurds are starting to learn the limits of Russian and American support in Rojava. So sooner or later, the Kurds are going to have to turn south towards Damascus and work out. There's going to be a bargaining, a negotiation, and we know that almost everyone else in Syria rejects the idea of political economy for the Kurds and insist on administrative autonomy. The Kurds want the opposite. They'll presumably come up with something that looks like a mix between the two, and maybe it's not called either, I don't know. But I just don't see the Syrian Kurds being able, ultimately, to escape rebuilding a relationship with the central state in Damascus. I would like to touch on the humanitarian issue, because I do agree that, the fate of the Syrian people, of millions and millions and millions of refugees, of displaced persons, and of people even living in their homes who have suffered, the loss of generations of education, trauma, disability. It's horrendous. And as I argued earlier, even peace is going to be painful. Peace is almost impossible for the regime to survive, because peace has requirements, material, financial, and so on, that the regime cannot resolve. Iran and Russia, even in the war, did not offer significant financial aid. They're not going to offer massive financial aid in the future. The US, the EU, given their own issues, their shift in politics, Trump is certainly not going to pour billions into Syria. The EU has its own problems, the Eurozone has its own problems, the Gulf have lower oil revenue. Where's the money going to come from? We're not going to get money on the scale that's needed. So Syria will remain, I think, a highly problematic place. Politically unstable, socially unstable, very difficult to attract refugees to go home when there's no jobs, when there's no investment, and so on. This is going to be a big problem. And when you add to that Iraq next door, in my view, and I look to hearing from our Iraqi colleagues here, sadly, with deep regret, I think that Iraq, the battle with Mosul is not the last or most important battle. I don't mean military maybe, but the crisis of the Iraqi state, no one's addressing it. I mean, this is why Daesh came in, this is why Mosul fell, whether it's failure of delivery, corruption, the fact, different ministries being farmed out. We now have 2 armies in Iraq, which is a trend, I think, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Lebanon, Palestine. From now on, and I think in the long term, the Iraqi state, Syrian state, all these places, because of the inability to create one national identity, one central state, and a new social contract, I think these are not going to be fixed soon. And one of the manifestations is to have dual militaries from now on. We are going to have, a schizophrenic army, 2 armies in these countries, whatever we call them. But the battle for Baghdad, I think, is the real battle. It's the next battle, I think. Hopefully only political, but I think that's more fundamental to what comes next. So if you look at Iraq and Syria, you look further afield to Yemen and Libya, Lebanon and Jordan are not in great shape, and tensions, social, economic, and political, are increasing in these countries. I hope that'll be all, but they're not secure entirely. And then on top of everything, we have a Gulf crisis, which will affect revenue, investment, the flow of aid and assistance from these countries, whether to Yemen, which is a war they don't know how to stop, or back to Syria again. So to place the humanitarian crisis in the middle of this, I agree entirely with Mr. Gülüoğlu, but sadly I don't think governments are going to prioritize this, but it is going to be maybe the strongest feature, the social and economic crisis of millions of people. And I'll add one more, I'm happy to talk about whenever you want, Egypt. In my view, I work a lot on Egypt, on the military economy, so I understand a lot more about the broader economy. I believe Egypt is going into social meltdown in, say, 3 to 5 years. What that means exactly, Syria, no, not necessarily. Yemen, Libya, not necessarily, hopefully not. But Egypt is going into somewhere, into crisis. So we've talked about all these other places. Imagine, Egypt, 95 million people. Syria will look like, a picnic. If millions of people in Egypt really can't get enough, calories per day, start pushing across the border, I don't know what will happen exactly. So this is the picture for the region. And then one last word there is that I agree entirely that there needs to be a rethinking. We keep approaching refugee problems, and this is something I wrote about several times in the last 2 years, as emergencies and as sort of short-term, and about relief only. Give them food, give them water and shelter, rather than a fundamental rethink. And I think the Turkish experience is very interesting for all sorts of reasons, but bottom line is the Turkish approach to accepting, integrating refugees and trying to create a legal framework for them to operate is a break with that pattern, and a very important one to learn from. Unfortunately, in Lebanon, where I'm based, or in Jordan, there was a very different approach. Jordanians were more successful. The Lebanese basically want to pretend the problem isn't there, and if they're nasty to the refugees, maybe they'll go home. And we have a repetition of what happened with the Palestinian refugees, who, what is it now, since 1948, 70 years later, in Lebanon, but also in Syria, were never given political rights, but in Lebanon were never even given civil rights, aren't allowed to work. And if you don't allow work, which is where Turkey has been better, then you don't transform them and you don't allow them to contribute to the economy, to the tax system, to social security, pensions and funds. It's only by allowing these things that you actually help the host country. Turkey understood this, and still it's got this massive problem, which, as you say, as Fuad was saying earlier, the hospitality crisis. as long as it's hospitality, it will become a worse crisis, I guess. My hunch. I haven't, but Turkey clearly, as a middle-income country, far more diverse economy, far more developed state institutions, I think still has the means to deal with this. But for Lebanon, for Jordan, I think this is something that has to stay on the radar.
Teşekkürler. I'm Ata Atalay from General Secretariat for the National Security Council. Though you partly mentioned, you just mentioned the issue, I would like to shift back to the beginning of your speech, where you mentioned that the wider political military game was going on, and then coming back to Trump administration. Yes, there is no clear-cut political roadmap, but a sharper military policy and approach. I agree, but the point I would like to raise is, do you see the cooperation with PYD and YPG just at the military basis? This is the point I want to raise, because it was suggested that the Syrian Kurds and Turkey could cooperate by taking a promise or so on. So if such a thing is valid, will there be cooperation militarily by United States and politically by Turkey? How do you see this picture? Thank you.
My name is Dr. Hisham Alawi. I'm the ambassador of Iraq to Turkey, and I've been in Ankara for just over 1 year. Thank you very much for the two speakers for sharing their thoughts with us. I have a comment on Iraq and a comment on the crisis in Syria and the way forward. Very briefly, as far as Iraq is concerned, the situation in Iraq is concerned, I would like to disagree with Dr. Yazid that the worst days are over. If you go back to the middle of 2014, I think we were in a much worse situation in 2014-15 than we are now. The Iraqi government has managed to, supported by our religious and political leaders, has managed to bring the Iraqis together, and we were very successful in defeating Daesh and liberating our cities and towns in different provinces, and I think we all agree that we are at the last stage of liberating the remaining of Nina and inshallah the other cities and towns, and there are only very few remaining, Hawija and Sharqa. I think we have obviously enormous challenges when it comes to promoting tolerance and peaceful coexistence and reconstructing those provinces that have been severely affected by the control of Daesh and dealing with the negative consequences of the bad treatment many Iraqis have received and families and so on. That will take obviously a long time to do, and with the support we are getting and hopefully we will continue to get from our international friends, we will succeed in achieving that. When it comes to Syria, let me begin obviously that we all agree that the Syrian conflict is a very complex one, and it's also part of a series of crises that we have in the region, and this is unique in the history of the region. For the first time we have so many conflicts affecting millions of people with serious negative consequences, not to just the countries that have been affected, but also to the region and beyond. If we add to that, that the future of the region, people living in this region, in my view, depends on our success in resolving those conflicts, creating political stability, dealing with the rise of extremism and terrorism, and creating the right environment that would lead to economic and trade integration rather than negative competition as we have seen in the past few years. Do you think that one of the reasons, or one of the major reasons for having the Syrian conflict in particular for over 6 years, and as you very clearly shared with us, you seem to think that we are far away from reaching a solution for things. Do you think one of the reasons is related purely to bad policies and miscalculations? I mean, some of the domestic players, regional players, international players initially thought that they could achieve regime change very quickly. And I think many in the region have disagreed with that, including our former Prime Minister, who said on repeated occasions that it's not going to be that easy to achieve regime change in Syria. And if that was the case, then maybe some regional international players moved away after seeing that they cannot achieve regime change, moved away to maintaining the conflict in a way that would keep the regime weak and manage the rise of extremist and violent groups. And if that's the case, do you really think that we need a paradigm shift in the way we approach this conflict? Rather than thinking that we could achieve regime change or gain anything meaningful from allowing the conflict to continue, we seriously need to work together to resolve this conflict and other conflicts in the region and work towards achieving political stability and hopefully economic integration that would be in the interest of people in the region.
Can you hear me? Sam Hiller from the Century Foundation. I just want to register kind of, I disagree on one point with Yazid. I mean, I agree broadly that the kind of trajectory of the conflict is headed towards this reintegration of most of these areas into the regime and its structures. I do think, though, that we're likely to see some substantial variation by area, including a handful, potentially Daraa, potentially Euphrates Shield, that I could imagine maybe remaining outside regime control and de-linked from the regime potentially indefinitely, or at least for the foreseeable future. But also I'd like to flag the case of the northwest specifically, of Idlib and West Aleppo, which seems like it has special relevance for Turkey and Turkish policy, and in which, I mean, my understanding is that the kind of the character of the armed opposition and then the factional makeup of this area has not been managed successfully in a way that makes reintegration into the Syrian state on any sort of consensual or negotiated basis probably impossible. So I think that because of Jabhat al-Nusra's effective dominance in this area, I think that what we're more likely to see is just kind of continued dysfunctionality, violent dysfunctionality in the best case, and then in the worst case, something more likely to more like a crisis that would have, it seems, pretty grave implications for Turkey in terms of the creation of new humanitarian needs and potential new large-scale refugee flows towards Hatay. I think that I mean, in this area specifically, I think that even if the de-escalation agreement has temporarily put off a confrontation in this area, I think that's probably untenable. So this is just something that I think should be on the kind of the Turkish policy radar, just because I don't see that area ending in kind of a nice, orderly fashion. I think it's likely to be substantially more messy.
Thank you, sir.
Ayşe Sözen Uslar, of the International Relations in the President's Office. I would like to make some points. First of all, I think there is a kind of misperception about Turkish policy towards Syria, which is Turkey is primarily concerned about the establishment of a Kurdish state in Syria. This is not true actually, because Turkey's foreign policy towards Syria is based on 4 principles. First of all, to protect the territorial integrity of Syria. Secondly, provide security and humanitarian aid to the people of Syria. And thirdly, to support democratic demands of Syrian people. And fourthly, follow open door policy. So, since the beginning, Turkish policy with regard to the Syrian war stands at very principled position, and I think I can also add one more point. Turkey also offered to create a safe zone to sort out the problem in Syria, and discussed about this with its allies, especially with its Western allies. But whenever Turkey discussed about creating a safe zone in northern Syria, our friends in Europe emphasized that yes, this is a perfect idea, but unfortunately it is not possible if the US doesn't support to create a safe zone in Syria. So the US position is critical in sorting out Syrian war. I also would like to touch upon your point about Astana process. Astana process is very important for Turkey. Turkey is one of the parties of initiating this process, but starting Astana process, Turkey doesn't abandon the Geneva process, because Geneva process is the diplomatic side of sorting out the problem, and it is very important to continue the diplomatic discussions of solving Syrian war. Otherwise, we are all, as all humans, we are going to lose our trust in universal values and international order, and what actually we created in the last century in the name of having an international law and international order in our global world. On the other hand, we are seeing the discussions are stuck in Geneva process, unfortunately. That's why Astana process is very important. And I want Mr. Yazid to elaborate more on Astana process, how after having these de-escalation zones and having a ceasefire on the ground, how the parties in the Astana process can elaborate on creating a new state administration in Syria, and it is, of course, it's very important to protect territorial integrity of Syria for Turkish perspective, because we have been suffering from the divisions in our region, and we don't want to see more divisions anymore. This is not only about seeing a new Kurdish state in northern Syria, but because we concern about the future of our region, the recent Qatar crisis and the other crises in the region, showing that there are more micro states projects are coming to the region, and this is quite dangerous for the Middle East. And I would like to hear about your comments, how these three parties, especially Russia, Iran, and Turkey, elaborate on how to write a new constitution for Syria and to defeat terrorism and to have democratic elections in Syria.
One last question from Antalya.
No, thank you. My name is Hamza Sharif. I'm former director of the Nahrain Center for Strategic Studies in Baghdad. Now I'm retired, so I am independent. Yeah, I agree with Yazid about the concerns that after liberation, maybe the easier part is the liberation of Nineveh and other areas. Whatever, I mean, however, that there was a lot of sacrifices there, financially, human. Yes, it was fully recognized in our new national security strategy that was published and approved by the Council of Ministers in March last year. The corruption, the reconstruction and others. The corruption is one tier one threat for Iraq now. It is recognized, it's written there, acknowledged. But about the two armies you mentioned, that the second army, and I believe you mean the popular mobilization. Yeah, there is a concern, but the popular mobilization will not be like the Revolutionary Guard in New York, for different reasons, and I'm sure that you know that. We don't have a revolution in New York, and so there was an occupation there. The United States with other international coalition forces, and then they come and change the regime. For me, it is good. But we need to work very hard regarding the national identity, and again, this is very well addressed in our national security strategy. And this is what I want just to mention. Thank you.
Well, again, a very stimulating, challenging second round of questions and comments. I'll start first with Atalay's question about can there be, if I understood correctly, sort of US-Kurdish military relationship and a Turkish-Kurdish political relationship. Now, could there be, I can't answer that question, maybe Aisha could better than me, definitely, but I mean, my concern is that the Americans, because there's this problem in American policy making, the military are clear about building military relationships, and they are with the PYD and providing arms and so on. But, okay, and then what? In 2 months' time, in 6 months' time, with bases or without bases? I mean, until the Islamic State is defeated conclusively, I think the Americans, the military, will continue, faced with different choices, I think they'll keep choosing the Kurdish forces as long as there's no better alternative in their view on the ground. And it'd be very interesting, and I'm here speaking like an amateur, a dilettante, whether it's possible for Turkey to transform this situation politically by saying, let's see this as an opportunity for us to change the politics of what's going on. That would be very interesting. I just can't judge that, whether it's feasible, whether it's likely. Turkey has so many more assets and resources, and I don't just mean financial or institutional, political, cultural, whatever. It's in a far stronger position than almost any of the other players involved here. Better than Iran, given the problems of the Iranian economy, of all sorts of things there. Turkey is in a far better position to take political initiatives that others can't take. And that could transform the Syrian situation from being a net threat to being, you know, and to address the aims, the 4 or 5 main aims. I mean, I think I take those as sincere, but then there's the real politics of day-to-day and where you find the compromises and what you do today and what you do in the future. And because this is linked to Turkish domestic realities as well, the Kurdish question in particular, it's up to Turkey, I think, to take those initiatives and come up with a new approach. But again, I can't really say more. Now, I agree with Ambassador Alawi about, you know, the need for a different paradigm and working together. I don't think that external actors sort of deliberately created or maintained the Syrian conflict. I think that's an outcome of something else. It's the result, but not the intention. So, in my view, the real tragedy of Syria, in one way you could say, is that Syria was not important enough to anyone of the external actors to invest enough political or military or financial means to really make a difference. They were all invested sufficiently to block someone else. None of them were committed enough to make to break, let's say, the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. I mean, regardless of what supports or doesn't support, but that was decisive. That was a real investment. No one was willing to invest that in Syria. Not the Russians, not the Americans, and even Iran, which has a real interest, has been very economical. You know, they gave just enough to keep the regime alive, financially, credit lines, cheap oil, a few hundred advisors, militiamen. But they haven't invested in a huge way. So the consequence is a stalemate strategically. I did chemistry for my first degree, so in chemistry you have something called dynamic equilibrium. So if you put in more chemicals, you drive the reaction further, but ultimately you're producing other compounds that then counterbalance and you simply reach a new equilibrium. So that's what we've seen in the last few months, that the Russian intervention has now then led to a Turkish intervention, regardless of what the aims of each are, and then an American intervention, not just the air bombing, but I'm talking about support for factions on the ground. So suddenly this, what used to be a proxy war through Syrian combatants, is now more directly a competition, not a hot war, but nonetheless a sort of strange competition between these external actors, and I think we're simply establishing a new dynamic equilibrium. And I'll comment here quickly on what Sam said. I mean, I've followed Sam for a long time, I've corresponded by email, and now I finally get to meet him in person. Or did we meet once in Beirut? I can't remember. Anyway, we'll work it out. So here we are. I take Sam's points about the trend and the variations, and that it'll be different in Idlib. I agree entirely, and why it'll be different in Idlib. But I think the broad trend will still be the same. And here's the critical thing. I mean, the regime ability to reintegrate, say, Raqqa, or Daraa for that matter, I think is far higher than it is for Idlib, for historical, social reasons, whatever. But because Idlib is dependent on access to Turkey, the question is, okay, we're dealing with realities as we know them now, but say in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, if there's a process, if the Astana process takes us places which are more advanced and do start creating some sort of viable stability or ceasefire in Syria, then there will be an expectation that the Syrian armed opposition groups in Idlib and western Aleppo, plus the ones in Jarablus, need to become part of that process. And that may mean that they have to play the role of policing. Because one of the issues for the safe zone always was, everyone, especially in the West, who wanted a safe zone, and if only, we could do a safe zone, you don't have to confront Russia, you don't have to have a whatever, safe zones are easy. most people promoting safe zones didn't think about one thing. A safe zone was always seen as how to stop the regime from bombing people and defending it against regime attack. But a safe zone also means you monitor and police the safe zone from inside, also vis-à-vis the opposition. You don't have to repress the opposition, but the opposition can't be allowed to have the freedom of military action in a safe zone without violating the concept of a safe zone. I mean, there's always going to be this paradox, and people didn't address this properly. In future, if we're going to sort of consider that the safe zone of Jarablus and the de-escalation zones ultimately become sort of one and the same thing, they could merge, and that might be partly a response to Aisha's question about, you know, what could Astana do? I think there will be a convergence of these different types of zones to become one format. But the zones won't work unless the people on both sides of that security barrier or boundary comply and enforce. So the Syrian regime will be expected to force all the militias and people fighting for it to observe the de-escalation. But the people in the opposition areas will also have the same obligation, because if not, then the Air Force will come in and bomb them. That's the basic deal. I mean, so Idlib is an area where the opposition groups may say, well, we sign on, we're part of Astana, we are committed, but then who deals with Tahrir al-Sham, with the jihadis? It may be, you know, combined air attack by everyone. It might be that, you know, the opposition is told, it's your headache, you deal with it, you police. But and here I want to touch on the future prospects for Astana, or where Astana could go. I think that's a fascinating question, a very important one, a big challenge, because I still think that no matter what approach any of us take, Syria is going to be, as I've said several times, highly impoverished, financially, economically. It's not just about reopening borders. I mean, regaining external market access, networks, trading networks, Syrian businessmen. How soon will Syrian businessmen repatriate their capital? I think they're going to be very slow and cautious. They're not going to rush home. Not unless there's a very clear change in how Syria functions, how the economy functions, how contracts are awarded, how the central bank manages exchange rates. All these things are still in the hands of the regime. Not many businessmen will go back quickly, let alone refugees. So, having said that, I still think there have to be some attempts at concrete answers to this very good question. So one is, can there be an attempt to revive normal civilian institutions and administrative structures in regime areas and opposition areas as part of the de-escalation, i.e. Turkey, Russia and Iran as the three participants, the first two are the most important, have a plan that this is not just about military de-escalation, but a more detailed plan on reactivating civil administration in these areas. And I think, again, sooner or later that means linking those two civil administrative processes. But at least for the initial phase, for the Russians to support, endorse and help protect support for civil administration inside opposition areas. And this is something they stated early on in the process, which was interesting for me. They've been thinking about this since March last year, proposing, you know, local government, local decentralization administratively, and that they would be willing to help the flow of reconstruction aid into opposition areas as part of the deal. So I think that has to be really expanded and tied then to opening up economic opportunities. But then you start to play in an area, a sort of gray zone, which comes back to the earlier question about humanitarian assistance. The regime would love the external actors to start saying, look, we want to help revive the economy so as to encourage refugees to go home, so encourage businessmen to go home, so as to encourage all these good things we need. And the regime will say, yes, we're all for this, fine. Lift sanctions. EU, give us money. And so on. And so we're going to start getting into a rather difficult complication, difficult area of negotiation that the EU already are having internally. And it becomes that the humanitarian argument, which is, look, there's finally a chance for peace. So now is the time to stop talking about principles. Now's the time to lift the limits and allow EU reconstruction money to go in. And already we see this debate. So I'm just pointing out that these are things that do need to be addressed, and I think that there should be a look at how border controls can be eased for the movement of people and goods already. The Turkish border, of course, with Idlib has always been very open, and there's a lot of movement of goods and trade and so on, and how to expand that. But we will start reaching a limit, because unless there's credit supply through the banking system or some alternative, we're going to keep hitting against the limits to what can be done within the existing framework. So we come back to those debates about sanctions and so on. And finally, I'll just throw out an idea here, and I will then want one little word in response to Hamza's point there, a very nice one about Iraq. But I think these are areas that I think Astana could usefully go into. Maybe this is already happening, I'm just not aware of it. But it means working with a lot of other partners in the EU and elsewhere who have to deal with, say, the banking sanctions, for instance, because how far can you go unless you start opening up credit? Lebanese banks, for instance, are so scared of being hit by the sanctions regime that they won't even allow ordinary Syrians to open bank accounts in Lebanon, although there is nothing in the sanctions regime that bans that. So it's going to take a while to rebuild that confidence. But they're not going to go back into Syria either and operate without these assurances of credit and of protection and guarantees and trade guarantees and whatever. The last thing on this broader question is, ironically, the question, and this goes back also to the point earlier comment about Iran, which is, what do Iran and Hezbollah in particular think the challenges are going to be for them in the future? Let's assume that they have complete victory, military victory. Bashar al-Assad regains all of Syria thanks to Iran and Hezbollah's aid and Russia, and it's total victory. Total victory of a government that has no money, with a broken economy, with no real access to markets, with a population that hates it, with its own loyalists who demand, say, we sacrifice 50, 70, 80,000 lives for you, we have compensation, and a regime that can offer none of this. And we'll still look to Iran and Hezbollah and Russia to keep helping and keep helping and keep helping, because this is going to be a highly unstable situation. So I'm very curious as to how they answer these questions of how do we move into the post-war situation. And I've had a few discussions with people in Beirut, and frankly, they don't know what to do about the future. They don't know, once the war is over, Hezbollah, how do they secure their interests in Syria? The same old way? No, they understand they're not going back to the old system. But what that means, we don't know. And there I'll just finish with the last comment again. Picking up on the issue of Iraq, that whether it's Iraq or Syria or many of these other Arab states, in a way we have a huge crisis of the nation state. I think that for the first time since the new modern state that was built in these countries in the wake of the Ottoman Empire, it went through colonial rule, independence, revolutions, coups d'etats, massive expansion, liberalization, privatization, huge changes in the politics and social economic policies. But the state still remained pretty much the same as a concept and as a structure. I think for the first time we're in a new area where we have something. We don't know where we're going, but this is no longer the old state. It doesn't exist. Or at least it's in real crisis. So the military issue is that, the popular mobilization force in Iraq might not be like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in Iran, but that's not really my point. Saudi Arabia has two armies, the National Guard and the regular army. And it has it for its own historical reasons, social and political, to do the relations between Najd and Hijaz and the various other tribal areas and so on. Sudan has two armies since around 1989, thanks to the regime change, and so you have the army and the Popular Defense Forces. I'm just saying that this is a trend, and it's tied to the crisis of the state and the fact that people in Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Sudan or wherever don't really accept and recognize this particular power structure as representing them and is offering them identity and social contract that they recognize and will buy into. There's no citizenship, if you like, in our sense. And without that, violence becomes the way we conduct politics. If you want to do politics in Iraq or Lebanon or Palestine, you have to have a gun. That's how you become a political party of significance. And that is very worrying. So the organization of violence is something that usually states claim as a monopoly. It's no longer that monopoly. And so part of the political compromise, the settlement of conflicts in these countries is to redefine in a way that state structure in ways that allow for at least two armies, maybe more. But we are formalizing this, and I think that the Hashd Sha'bi, once the war with Daesh is over, do you think that the Hashd Sha'bi is going to dissolve itself and disappear? So we will have a new permanent reality. I'm not opposed or supportive or anything. I'm not judging. I may be called Yazid, but that doesn't make me hostile to the Hashd Sha'bi.
Good one. Okay.
Thank you for these insightful talks and also great questions that stimulated further discussion. With that joke, we also came to the end of the program. At this stage, let me make two announcements. One on behalf of ORSAM. Tomorrow we are having another event, a report launch on Turkish-speaking DAESH supporters on Twitter. It will be at 2 p.m. in the afternoon at Büyükhanlı Park Hotel. The information is available on the website of ORSAM. Those willing to attend, you are most welcome. The second announcement from the Iran Center, Professor Ahmed. Would you like to, or shall I?
Sure, yeah. We are having a roundtable discussion tomorrow about Iran-Pakistan relations, but it's going to be more like Iran, Pakistani and Saudi relations, the triangle, at 11 a.m. in the morning at Algat, Center for Iranian Studies. So everybody invited.
Our speaker is
here also. Thank you. I mean, we'll debate, discuss the current issues. Thank you.
Oh, I just should have said earlier that I very much welcome anyone who would like to stay in touch with me or to follow up with our latest analysis, join our mailing list. I've got your names here, but I don't have your email addresses. You can, if you write them down or give me your card, I'd very happily stay in touch. Thanks once again for being here.
So we will have Yazid in Istanbul the Friday morning, but on behalf of Istanbul Police Center, I thank all of you for coming here and having this great discussion and making this possible. Also, always Shaban for collaborating with us. It's always nice to come to Ankara.
Thank you, Hocam. Those of you who have time and who want to join lunch after the event, we are just moving to the next building. You are all welcome. Thank you again. I hope to see you tomorrow at the next event.